Jimmy Fallon had hosted thousands of interviews, but he had never lost his words completely. Not until that Tuesday night when the cameras were still rolling, the studio audience was watching, and Keanu Reeves suddenly stopped mid-sentence after hearing a recording that changed everything. What happened next wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't supposed to happen on live television. But sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones nobody plans. It started as just another typical Tonight Show taping. Jimmy was in his element, cracking jokes, doing his signature impressions, and keeping the energy high as always. Keanu Reeves was there to promote his latest film, and the interview was flowing smoothly. The audience was laughing, the band was ready, and everything seemed perfect. But then Jimmy pulled out his phone to show Keanu something he thought would be funny, a fan-made video compilation. Instead, what played was something entirely different. Something that would stop the show, silence the studio, and reveal a side of both men that cameras rarely capture. But this is where the story really begins. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about a talk show moment, it's about two human beings connecting over something deeper than entertainment. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The Tonight Show studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Jimmy Fallon bounced around backstage, running through his monologue notes one final time, while the audience filed into their seats with that excited anticipation that only comes with live television. It was March 15th, 2024, and Keanu Reeves was scheduled as the main guest, always a fan favorite, and someone Jimmy genuinely enjoyed having on the show. Keanu arrived at 30 Rock earlier that afternoon, characteristically low-key and humble despite being one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. During the pre-interview, they discussed his upcoming John Wick sequel, his motorcycle company, and his recent philanthropic work. Everything seemed routine, professional, and ready for a great show. What nobody knew was that earlier that day, Jimmy had received an email from a fan named Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old teacher from Portland. The email contained a voice recording she had made for her father, who was battling late-stage cancer and was a massive Keanu Reeves fan. Sarah had written that her father's dying wish was simply to hear Keanu say his name, David Chen, just once. She had sent the recording to Jimmy's team as a long shot, hoping somehow it might reach Keanu. Jimmy's assistant had flagged the email, moved by Sarah's story, but with hundreds of fan requests coming in daily, it got buried in Jimmy's phone among other videos and voice messages he often reviewed during show breaks. He had meant to listen to it earlier but got caught up in rehearsals and his usual pre-show routine. The show opened with Jimmy's energetic monologue, hitting all the expected beats about current events and pop culture. The audience was warm and responsive, laughing at all the right moments. When it came time to introduce Keanu, the crowd erupted in the kind of genuine applause reserved for actors who have earned universal respect not just for their talent, but for their character. Keanu walked out with his characteristic humble wave, that slight smile that somehow managed to be both shy and confident at the same time. He was dressed in his usual understated style: dark jeans, black shirt, simple jacket. As he settled into the guest chair, the interview began flowing naturally. They talked about his latest film, and Keanu shared behind-the-scenes stories with his typical thoughtfulness and dry humor. Jimmy was in his element, asking follow-up questions that showed he had actually watched the movie, making observations that made Keanu laugh genuinely. The chemistry between them was easy and authentic, two professionals who clearly respected each other. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. About 15 minutes into the interview, Jimmy decided to show Keanu some fan reactions to his movies that had been compiled on social media. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his saved videos to find the funny compilation his team had prepared. But as he scrolled, he accidentally tapped on Sarah's voice message instead. A woman's voice began playing through the studio speakers, clear, emotional, but trying to stay strong. "Hi, Mr. Reeves. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm recording this message for my father, David Chen. He's 67 years old, and he's been fighting cancer for 2 years now. He's always been your biggest fan, ever since Point Break. He used to take me to all your movies when I was little, and he would always say you seemed like the kind of person who understood what really mattered in life. The studio went completely silent. Jimmy's face showed confusion at first, then recognition as he realized this wasn't the video he meant to play. But something stopped him from immediately turning it off. Maybe it was the sincerity in Sarah's voice, or maybe it was the way Keanu had gone completely still, listening intently. Sarah's voice continued. Dad always talks about how you handle fame with dignity, how you're kind to everyone, how you've faced your own losses and still choose to be good to people. He's in hospice care now, and yesterday he told me his only regret is that he never got to thank you personally for being the kind of man he tried to teach me to look for in this world. Keanu's expression had shifted completely. The relaxed, promotional interview demeanor was gone, replaced by something much more raw and present. Jimmy looked between his phone and Keanu, unsure whether to stop the recording or let it continue. I know this is probably impossible, Sarah's voice went on. But if there's any way you could just say his name David Chen just once, it would mean everything to him. He doesn't have much time left, and I want him to know that the person he admires most in the world at least knows he exists. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being who you are. The recording ended. The studio remained in absolute silence. 300 audience members, a full production crew, Jimmy, the Roots. Everyone was holding their breath. But all eyes were on Keanu, whose own eyes had filled with tears he wasn't trying to hide. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy could have laughed it off, made a joke about technology fails, and moved on to the next segment. That's what the show's rhythm called for. That's what his producers would have preferred. But instead, he set his phone down carefully and looked directly at Keanu. I'm so sorry, Jimmy said quietly, his usual animated energy completely gone. I didn't mean for that to play, but... Keanu raised his hand gently, stopping Jimmy mid-sentence. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. Don't apologize. What was her name again? Sarah Chen. And her father is David. Keanu nodded slowly, then did something that broke every talk show protocol. He stood up from his chair and walked directly to where Jimmy was sitting behind his desk. He gestured for Jimmy to hand him the phone. May I? Keanu asked. Jimmy handed over his phone without hesitation. Keanu looked directly into the main camera, holding the phone as if he were making a personal video call. Sarah, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes. This is Keanu. I want you to know that your message reached me, and I want you to play this for your father. He paused, taking a breath, then continued with the kind of presence that only comes from someone who has faced real loss and learned that authentic connection matters more than any performance. David Chen, Keanu said, speaking the name with genuine warmth and respect. Sarah tells me you've been a fan of my work for many years, but I want you to know that after hearing about you, I'm a fan of yours. Any man who raised a daughter like Sarah, who loves her father enough to reach out to a stranger on his behalf, is someone I would be honored to know. The audience was completely silent, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was the kind of silence that happens when people witness something truly meaningful happening in real time. Keanu continued recording. I've learned in my life that the connections we make, the love we share, and the kindness we show to each other, that's what actually matters. You sound like someone who understood that long before I did. Thank you for being a good man, David. Thank you for raising Sarah. And thank you for somehow teaching her that it's worth believing in the goodness of strangers. He looked at Jimmy, who was visibly moved, trying to maintain his composure but clearly affected by what was happening. Jimmy, could you make sure Sarah gets this? Absolutely. Jimmy managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. Keanu sat back down, but the interview had fundamentally changed. This wasn't a promotional stop anymore. It had become something else entirely. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the man behind the television persona became visible. You know what? He said, looking at Keanu and then directly at the camera. "I've been doing this show for years, and we have our rhythm, we have our segments, we have our commercial breaks. But sometimes something happens that's more important than any of that." He turned to his director, who was off camera. "Can we push the next segment back?" Without waiting for an answer, Jimmy continued. "Keanu, I don't know if you know this, but I lost my father when I was young too. Different circumstances, but I remember that feeling of wanting the people you love to be proud of you, wanting to connect them to the things that matter to you." Keanu nodded, listening intently. Jimmy went on. "When I started this show, my dad had already been gone for years, but I used to imagine what he would think if he could see me here. And I think what Sarah's doing for her father, that's love in action. That's someone refusing to let the people they love feel invisible." The audience began to softly applaud, but Jimmy raised his hand to keep the focus on the conversation. "The thing is," Jimmy continued, "we get fan mail every day, and most of it is wonderful, but this." Sarah wasn't asking for tickets or autographs. She was asking for her father to be seen, to be acknowledged. And I think that says something about both of them. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, something he was rarely seen without. He tore out a page and began writing something. The camera zoomed in slightly as he wrote carefully, thoughtfully. When he finished, he folded the paper and handed it to Jimmy. "Could you make sure this gets to Sarah as well, along with the video?" Jimmy took the note, and while he didn't read it aloud, his expression as he glanced at it showed that whatever Keanu had written had moved him deeply. "Of course," Jimmy said. "Absolutely." Then Keanu did something that no one expected. He looked directly at the audience. "I know a lot of you are here to have fun, to laugh, to forget about whatever difficult things might be happening in your lives," he said. "And that's important. Joy matters. Laughter matters. But so does this. So do the David Chens of the world, and the daughters who love them enough to reach out to strangers, and the talk show hosts who care enough to let an accident become a moment of connection." The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. "I want to say something to anyone watching who might be taking care of someone they love who's sick, or who's lost someone, or who's facing something that feels impossible." Keanu continued. "What you're doing matters. The love you're showing matters. And even when it feels like the world is too big and too indifferent to notice your pain or your love, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the universe finds a way to let you know that what you're feeling, what you're doing, what you're caring about, it all matters." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The studio erupted in applause. Not the polite, prompted applause of a typical talk show, but the kind of genuine, emotional response that happens when people witness something authentic. The Roots began playing softly, not a commercial break bumper, but something gentle and supportive. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews, and walked over to shake Keanu's hand. But instead of a handshake, Keanu stood and the two men embraced briefly, the kind of hug that happens between people who have just shared something meaningful. "Thank you," Jimmy said simply. "Thank you for letting it happen," Keanu replied. When they sat back down, the interview continued, but it was different now. They talked about Keanu's work with children's hospitals, about Jimmy's own charitable efforts, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform to reach people. The promotional aspects of the interview happened too, but they felt secondary to the human connection that had occurred. Near the end of the interview, Jimmy made one more decision that surprised everyone. "Before you go," he said to Keanu, "I want to read something from Sarah's original email that wasn't in the voice message." He pulled up the email on his phone. She wrote, "My father always says that Mr. Reeves seems like someone who would stop to help a stranger fix a flat tire, even if he was on his way to a movie premiere. He says that's the kind of person worth admiring, not someone who's famous, but someone who's famous and still decent." Jimmy looked up at Keanu. "I think your father was a good judge of character, Sarah." Keanu smiled, that genuine, slightly shy smile that had endeared him to millions of people over the years. "I hope so," he said quietly. 2 weeks later, Jimmy received another email from Sarah. David Chen had passed away peacefully, but not before hearing Keanu's message and reading his handwritten note, which simply said, "David, your love lives on through Sarah. That's the greatest legacy any man can leave. Kr." Jimmy kept that email, and according to those close to him, it changed how he approached every show after that night. The notebook Keanu had written in. Jimmy bought the same brand and started carrying one himself, writing notes to guests' families, fans who wrote in, anyone who needed to know they were seeing. Sometimes the most important moments happen when we're not trying to create them. That Tuesday night, a technical mistake became a reminder that behind every famous face, there's still a human being capable of extraordinary kindness. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs to see.